And we're off to a fascinating start with today's speaker, John Birdsall, and his topic, the making of James Beard, an American legend. Questions during Mr. Birdsall's presentation will go by the chat function. So if you have questions or comments, put it in chat and Mr. Birdsall will monitor that and or Pat, depending on how things go. Also, please make sure you are muted so that we don't hear your phone ringing in the background or your house partner coming to ask you what's for dinner. That's interesting, but we don't want to hear it. Thank you very much. And if you're not sure where the mute function is, it should be down on the lower left corner of your screen. And if you don't see it, move your cursor down there and move it around and a ribbon should pop up so you see it. It looks like a microphone, the old-fashioned microphones they had on the old radio shows. And we will have any announcements about Chow and Whatsits and further information about the November meeting will take place after Mr. Birdsall's presentation. So plan to stick around for that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Judy so she can introduce our speaker today.
Hi, it's Bruce. If I could just interrupt for 1 second. I happened to check the chat function and I'm seeing chat disabled. Pat, if there's something you can do about that, it doesn't look like some of the folks at least might not be able to use it to ask questions.
Okay, I will see what toggles are available.
My chat works.
Yeah, my chat works.
Okay.
I'm on Chrome. I don't know if that makes a difference.
I'm on an iPad, so.
Okay.
Well, I'll check around. If it's just mine, that isn't going to make any big difference.
Well, you might want to log in and out again. If all else.
Well, I'll.
You want me to?
Mine at
Either
first said it didn't work,
somebody
and then
send
it
a
said it
message.
worked, so
I
it
don't see
changed.
any messages in the chat.
Yeah, but it says Rob Reb.
Oh, there's one. There's a message.
Okay, I see one now. Is the chat working? Question mark. Looks like it now. I think we're good to go.
Yeah, and now I see it as well.
Oh
Okay.
boy, look.
Thank you, Karen. You turned mine on somehow.
All right, well, thank you for pointing it out, Bruce. And I guess I'm going to shut up, let John. That's why we hired John. He's going to.
Well, let me introduce John, if I may. And it is my great pleasure. And thank you, Pam, for giving me the opportunity to introduce John Birdsall, author of the engrossing biography of James Beard entitled The Man Who Ate Too Much. When this book was released, I knew that the author would be a great candidate to speak to the culinary historians of Washington. I have actually been following John's writing since I read his essay in the now defunct Lucky Peach magazine. And he wrote an essay entitled America, Your Food is So Gay. And as to James Beard, I was one of his fans, as I assume many in the audience are as well. And I think that James Beard's book on bread, which came out in the 70s, was the first book I ever cooked my way totally through, recipe 1 to the very end, and made every single bread recipe in that book. John Birdsall, based in Tucson, is the recipient of not just 1, but 2 James Beard Awards for writing. He's been published in Food and Wine, Saveur, Bon Appetit, the LA Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and many other places. He's cooked in professional kitchens, has been a restaurant critic, and a feature writer for many publications. If you've not already read this book, I think that after this presentation, you will want to go out and get it right away. It looks like this. John Birdsall has researched and revealed the life of James Beard in a way that no one before him ever had. You'll come away enlightened, sometimes a little saddened, but always fascinated as the veil is lifted and we get to understand more about the man who ate too much. Without further ado, let me turn the program over to John Birdsall.
Well, thank you very much, Judy. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me, for having me here. Really thrilled to be here today. I'm always especially thrilled to speak to people who are interested in food history. I'm a total food history nerd, of course. So today, I wanted to talk about a theme that runs through some of James Beard's his three most compelling books. And let's see if I can share my screen with you guys. Great. So because you all are in Washington, D.C., I thought I would really focus on the idea of American food, which was really had become synonymous with James Beard. So a quick overview: James Beard was born in 1903 in Portland, Oregon. He died in New York City in early 1985. And since really the early 1950s, he become synonymous with the notion of American food, which was a notion that was really hard to define. I mean, it's still impossible to define. It was really hard to define in that period, the 1950s through the 1970s, in slightly different ways than we attempt to define it now. But James Beard really embodied in his work, in his person, in his actual body, his large frame. He really embodied the sense of American food for a generation of Americans, really like two generations of Americans. So I wanted to explore that idea of what is American food through the lens of three of James Beard's most successful books. Not his best-selling books, but definitely his most successful books. The first one is The Fireside Cookbook that was published in 1949. It really put James Beard on the map as a national voice for food. The second is his autobiographical work, sort of semi-autobiographical book on food called Delights and Prejudices, which was published in 1964. And the third is maybe his most famous book, published in 1972, called James Beard's American Cookery. Really a huge kind of encyclopedic book that includes lots of historical information, lots of delving into 19th century American cookbook authors. So first, let's see. A little bit about James Beard. Long before he really became the face of American food, later 20th century, he had a very strange upbringing. Here he is as a boy on the front stoop of his family's home in Portland, Oregon. You can see his father, John Beard, a very strange and imposing figure. His mother above him, Elizabeth Beard. Elizabeth Beard was an immigrant. She was born in England in the early 1860s, and she immigrated to the United States in the early 1880s and ended up in the sort of wild city, kind of a backwater city of Portland, Oregon, which still hadn't entirely shaken off its kind of wild frontier roots. And he's also sitting with his half-sister, Lucille, from John Beard's first marriage. And so James Beard grew up in, as I said, a really strange household. I mean, maybe it was sort of typically American in the way that all these strange forces came together. John Beard was from a family that was from the South originally, and settled in Kentucky, and then kind of kept moving west from Iowa and then to the Pacific Northwest. And John Beard was really at the end of the sort of great, the other great migration, which was the sort of westward movement of Americans to, take up land grants to settle, quote unquote, the West. But this idea of his father being of this pioneering generation was always very important to James Beard. It became part of it was definitely part of his family's mythology that James Beard was somehow related to the previous generation that had really kind of, and again, I put this in quotes because we know that it's a false concept, really sort of opened and settled, the great Wild West. And Elizabeth Beard couldn't have been more different, although she also had, she maybe more than John had a real pioneering spirit. She was born in a pretty poor, to a pretty poor family in England. They were in domestic service for rich people. And Elizabeth Beard was quite rebellious. And she was sent to live with very conservative Christian relatives. And she rebelled, and she ended up running away. She ended up sailing across the Atlantic to meet up with a woman who she knew in Toronto. And in the course of working for a family, becoming a governess for 2 small children, she got to see essentially the whole northern sweep of the United States. The family was being relocated to the Pacific Northwest, and Elizabeth rode the trains with them. It's a very arduous journey before the Transcontinental Railroad had connected the Pacific Northwest. And so she really got this sort of flavor of America. She settled in Portland, Oregon, tried to become a businesswoman, which was very difficult for a single woman to do in all kinds of ways. And she ended up, through the help of men who she met and relied on, a couple of husbands, she was able to start and run a boarding house in Portland, Oregon, a kind of small boarding hotel. And she tried to set it apart from competing boarding hotels, which were very numerous at that time all over America, by the quality of the food. And so she was quite exacting with the food that she served at her boarding hotel's table. And this also really entered the mythology of James Beard. Later in life, he would James Beard was always about rewriting the myth of James Beard throughout his life. And this was a major point. He used to kind of exaggerate and say that his mother was the manager of a great hotel, which is not exactly true. And she sold the hotel when she married John Beard. So James Beard didn't even know the hotel, but he would talk later about growing up in this large, fabulous hotel kitchen with its huge copper pots. So this is the grounding of James Beard. Elizabeth and John did not get along, to put it mildly. They pretty much actively hated each other. It was a marriage of convenience, and Elizabeth Beard hated John's relatives. She hated being the sort of dutiful wife as it was understood in the 1890s and around the turn of the century. And one of her ways of coping was to take young James to the coast. So she bought a little piece of land on the Oregon coast south of Astoria in a place called Gearhart. And she built a little cottage. And so, even though it wasn't seemly for a married woman, a married middle-class woman to work, she would go with James to the coast during the summer, and she would sort of quietly, privately cater for vacationing families on the coast. You could come to her cottage for a meal, or she would create this kind of fabulous breakfast on the beach for you and your party who had been clamming or maybe picking strawberries in the dunes. So very much immersed in food. And young James, as he was growing up in this really stretched, emotionally stretched, really difficult family, really leaned on food as a source of comfort, as a source of solace, and as a source of pleasure. But really, the family disliked each other so much that even back in Portland, James and his parents and his half sister, they would end up eating alone almost every night. Elizabeth would cook for the family. They had a family cook who was a Chinese American man named Julette, who would cook for the family, but they would all take their meals separately, in their respective bedrooms. So James Beard, I'll give you the quick version of James Beard's life. He was sent to Reed College in Portland as a young man, as an 18-year-old. Reed College was a new institution. It was quite progressive for its time, really valued, it really touted its West Coast values. Reed College was a liberal arts college, and it saw its mission sort of correcting the evils of the Ivy League. So lots of nepotism, lots of money, lots of power. So Reed College was going to be open and democratic. And it admitted, in its first years, it admitted as many women students as men. It admitted Jewish students, which was unusual. And so James Beard really sort of thrived in this atmosphere, that sense of openness, that sense of democratic spirit, that sort of anti-elitism of Reed College really imprinted on James Beard, although he was only at Reed College for a year during his freshman year. At the end of his freshman year, he was caught in the act of having sex with a young male professor, and he was sort of quietly bundled away. He was thrown out of the college. The reason given was that he had insufficient scholarship. And so this was a huge traumatic event in James Beard's life, and a major theme of my book, just how James Beard sort of navigated this secret or complicated, coded gay life while being one of the most famous and recognizable people in America later on. It's a very sort of complicated dance that he had to do, and that talent for myth making about himself, for creating stories about himself that maybe had a bit of truth in them, but were false, was something that James Beard really used to tell his own story, and also significantly, I believe, really kind of tell this story of American food. So creating a myth about himself, about his own upbringing, about his own roots. He really applied this talent for creating myths when he started talking about American food. And the idea that a lot of Americans in the mid to late 20th century had about American food came in part from sort of James Beard's really convincing storytelling about what American food was. Here's James Beard in 1953 in Greenwich Village. So after being sent away from Reed College in a sort of secret private disgrace, he thought he'd like to try for a career on the stage, either as an actor or as a great opera tenor. He didn't have the talent for either, really, didn't have enough talent to succeed. But his mother, and I think partly to kind of overcome the scandal, to sort of get him out of Portland for a while until things cooled down, she sent him to London to study at the Royal Academy of Music. He wasn't successful in getting in, so she got a private singing teacher for him. And while he tried to learn opera, tried to learn to be a tenor, he was really more interested in being free in London and Paris. So he spent about 5 months in London with a side trip to Paris. And although he wasn't really interested in food at that time, he was really interested in sort of sowing his wild oats and sex and sort of looking at this whole new world of freedom that existed in cities that had far more sophistication, far more opportunities for certainly for a young gay man to experience friendship and sex than Portland, Oregon. And so he comes back, he tries to have a career in the theater in New York City. So this is in the 1920s, the mid 1920s. He doesn't succeed. He doesn't like New York City. He's not going anywhere. It's kind of dawning on him that he really doesn't have the talent to be on the stage. So he tries for a career in the sort of backstage arts, set building, that kind of thing. But it's very difficult. He doesn't quite get a foothold. So he moves back to Portland, hates it, moves back to New York City definitively in the 1930s and stays there until he dies. And he becomes really, of course, associated with Greenwich Village, where he has a few houses, ending most famously in 1973 with what we now call Beard House, 167 West 12th Street in Greenwich Village, which is owned by the James Beard Foundation now. And so here's James Beard in 1953 at a party, a backyard party of fellow food writers and food publicists in New York City. Here he's toasting a woman who's a publicist for the Taylor Wine Company in upstate New York. And they've hosted this party to sort of promote their wines. They have the most sort of famous food writers and food editors in America, which is a very small world in 1953. Everybody's concentrated in New York City. And so this is when James Beard is really starting to become famous, certainly famous in New York City. And he's already starting to become famous nationally, a nationally recognized expert in food and wine. And you can really see from this photo that he has this sort of great smile. He has this great charisma. He has this personality that wins people over. And this is part of his success. Also, he was 6'3". His weight would always hover around 300 pounds as an adult. And he really, this was something that he was bullied for all his life, for being large. But as a food writer, as a food personality in an America that's increasingly obsessed with thinness and dieting, the Grapefruit Diet book is one of the great publishing successes of the 1950s. And at the same time, James Beard is really owning this sense of pleasure, of eating for flavor, entertaining with style and flair and panache, and not worrying about dieting, not worrying about being thin. It's really about sort of eating in a way that the French eat, which is for flavor and pleasure, enjoying the occasion. So when James Beard writes his first cookbook, which is in 1940, the American cookbook publishing landscape is very different than it is today. But the most successful, the best-selling cookbooks of the mid-20th century and later, of course, are culinary Bibles. So books like The Joy of Cooking that are comprehensive in nature. Americans weren't interested in owning a lot of cookbooks. Cookbooks were not something people read for pleasure. They were utilitarian texts. And the idea was, you might own one or two cookbooks, keep them in the kitchen, have them for the rest of your life, and cook from them. And of course, you would cut out recipes from the newspaper or magazines that looked interesting, and you would stuff them in the one or two cookbooks that you owned. And so the idea of cookbooks that had personality and voice. The Joy of Cooking does have Irma Rombauer's voice. It sort of gets watered down in successive editions. And really the scale sort of kind of moves to the side of being kind of comprehensive and kind of erasing her specific voice. And one of the best-selling American cookbooks of all time in this edition, which is the 1950 edition, Betty Crocker's picture cookbook, and successive editions, were books, again, that were comprehensive in nature. Betty Crocker is an invented person. And so the idea of a cookbook that is smaller in scope, that might be autobiographical, that might reflect the author's voice, certainly, but also their lived experience. I ate this here and I got the recipe, and this is what I'm going to share with you now. That didn't really exist. That isn't something that Americans were interested in buying. So there was a niche cookbook publishing realm with small books like I described. Those had almost no sales. Those were something that publishers would sort of bring out to test the market, to see if maybe there could be interest in books that were different, that had an authoritative voice, and that had a personality behind them. But as of 1950, that was not the case in the United States. And this is one of the pages from Betty Crocker's picture cookbook. These are the sort of gleaming test kitchens for General Mills, which had Betty Crocker. And of course, the whole Betty Crocker picture cookbook was an opportunity to sell flour, essentially. There's a huge preponderance of baking recipes, pies, cakes, quick breads, muffins, cookies. And this, of course, in a sense, sort of skews the general idea of what American food is. American food is heavily skewed toward baking and sweets. And this is in part because this was a deliberate effort to sell those products to the American kitchen. The exception to that were authors in the so-called gourmet movement in the 1930s. MFK Fisher is the most distinguished and probably most famous writer in that group. And MFK Fisher isn't writing cookbooks as the American public, someone who would buy Joy of Cooking or the Betty Crocker cookbook would really understand it. They're voice-driven, they're self-consciously literary, and they talk about food in the context of, they're basically set within essays. And in the 1940s, the idea of American food is changing. And one successful book, which is also a comprehensive cookbook, was the Gold Cookbook by Louis P. de Goey. Louis P. de Goey was born in France. He was trained as a chef in France and immigrated to the United States. He cooked in restaurants in New York City, but then he cooked for wealthy people, wealthy New Yorkers. So he cooked this very kind of elevated French haute cuisine for private clients and their guests. In the early 1940s, when Gourmet magazine launches, Earl McCausland, who launched it, hired Louis P. de Goey as the magazine's first food editor. The Gold Cookbook, if any of you have sort of delved into it, is really strange. I mean, it is like 1,200 pages. It's hugely comprehensive. And instead of this idea of kind of, blending American ingredients into certain techniques, it kind of keeps them separate. So Louis P. de Goey presents, classic haute cuisine, French, and what is coming to be known as continental cuisine recipes. And then he'll have the next recipe for a kind of, a squirrel and sweet potato stew from the South. But they don't live together very comfortably. Also at this time, The New York World's Fair of 1939 is coming. And so there's this new idea of America as a collection of regions. And so in the late 1930s, there are some books that really celebrate American regional food. So Sheila Hibben, who is the main food writer for the New Yorker, writes a book about regional food in the USA. And these books are typically, and then there's a sort of famous regional American cookbook that comes out of the New York World's Fair of 1939. And these books are really a collection, like state by state. So each state will have 1 or 2 or 3 recipes that are deemed typical of that state. So American food is impossible to define, but one way that cookbook authors and publishers in the 1930s go about defining it is as a collection of these distinct regions. So after the war, after World War II, in the 1940s, publishing, American book publishing is changing, and there's a new emphasis, with the end of World War II, there's a new emphasis in American life. So all of the food rationing that had existed during the war is of course over, and Americans are ready to live. They're ready to consume. And so there's a new, as the sort of Cold War rises, there's a huge new movement for American consumerism. And of course, this encompasses everything from buying new homes and buying new cars to outfitting your kitchen in ways that were deemed unthinkable for most middle-class families before the war. Gleaming large refrigerators and deep freezes and appliances, mixers and blenders. So there's a lot of money to be made by sort of catering to this consumerist market in the kitchen. And so American book publishers are looking at this and thinking there must be a market for a cookbook that is, that sort of goes beyond the sort of cookery Bibles that Americans are still buying in huge numbers. So this top photo here on the left is a man named Georges Duplay, and there's a little sketch of him in the bottom. And Georges Duplay was from France. He moves to New York and he becomes the production designer, essentially, for a division of Simon & Schuster, which is a kind of, taking chances in American publishing. They're trying to sort of shake things up. And so one of the things that they're trying to do is to produce these lavishly produced picture books for adults. And so in 1946 or 1947, they published the Fireside Book of Folk Songs, which has sort of lyrics and music for all these folk songs around the world with these lavish illustrations. They have this great corral of artists, and so high quality production values. This becomes a bestseller, by the way, the Fireside Book of Folk Songs. And Simon & Schuster and their Sandpiper Press imprint is doing all kinds of fireside books. There are fireside books for, stories, songs, myths, legends, dog raising. So they're really sort of large format, what we would call coffee table books. And so they decide that they are ready to take a chance on one that's based on food, to see if the American public would buy a lavishly illustrated picture book of food that included recipes and stories. Sandpiper Press, Simon & Schuster has success at the same time with the Little Golden Books. They bring out these books that are inexpensive, and they use these illustrators who who they are working with. And this is Alice and Martin Provenson. They're illustrators who moved to New York City from LA. Martin had worked for Walt Disney. So it's a very accessible style of sort of illustrating, very cartoony. You can see Walt Disney here. On the left is Dorothy Bennett, who becomes an editor. And so in the late 1940s, Georges Duplay, who we saw, as I said, wants to take a chance on doing a book, basically a lavishly illustrated picture book about food for adults. And they're casting around for an author. And James Beard, who is back from the war, he's written 2 more books. So he's written 3 books now for a national publisher, but they're a fairly small one, M. Barrows, that did fairly cheaply produced editions and just published lots of books about cooking, child rearing, etc. James Beard goes on television in 1946 with a show sponsored by Borden called I Love to Eat. Of course, he's able to use his theatrical background to sort of ham it up TV. So this show lasts a little more than 1 season, not quite 2 seasons before it's canceled, but he does live cooking demonstrations on television and has a lot of, all of his sort of charm, all of his sort of commanding voice, as well as his knowledge of food, all of that grounding he has from his family really sort of comes through in these shows. So Georges Duplay and Simon & Schuster, they're interested in James Beard. They think he could really perhaps pull this off. So you see the cover of the Fireside Cookbook, published in 1949, which is illustrated by the Provensons in this kind of wild pastiche style. They're sort of bringing all these elements into it. The jacket of that book, the paper dust jacket, opens up to be a poster, which you can see here, that has these quotes about food, about pleasure, about the pleasures of the table, all this very sort of Americana style. I mean, this is the same time that Oklahoma is in first run on Broadway. And so there's this post-war sense of American exuberance, the sort of greatness of America, but America doesn't have a food voice. What's considered the best cooking in America, the best restaurants in America are French restaurants. French restaurants in New York City, in San Francisco, in Chicago, in New Orleans, essentially. So there isn't a celebration of American food as we know it. And this book attempts to do that. Another illustration from the book. You can see the sort of Disney style, and it sort of suits James Beard's voice, which is accessible. He has grounding in French food. He spent the last few years being mentored by a woman, Jeanne Owen, who is French, but she's in New York, and she's the head of the New York Wine and Food Society, which is probably the most influential food group in the United States at that time. Another one from Fireside. And also, frozen foods are among the most popular foods at the time in 1949. You can see here a little booklet that Birdsall produced about its frozen vegetables. And so James Beard gets the contract to write the Fireside book. He gets a flat fee of $5,000. So he doesn't get any royalties, any future royalties. And he has to produce basically 1,200 recipes in about 7 months. And so one of the things he does is he sort of borrows. So he takes recipes that he's already published in his first 3 books, tweaks them maybe a little bit. Dorothy Bennett, the editor you saw before, helps him tweak them. They're sort of better edited versions. And he has a chapter on frozen foods, and it borrows heavily from this Birdsall booklet. So James Beard, again, sort of creating a myth about himself and about American food, is not shy about borrowing, stealing recipes, plagiarizing himself. Jan Owen, who I mentioned, an important gourmet figure at this time in New York, and he learns a tremendous amount from him. So he learns from Jan Owen these traditional French recipes. Here's a book that Jan Owen got published in 1941. Here's James Beard again at this same party I showed earlier. This is 1953, the backyard in Greenwich Village. These are some of the most important food editors in America. You can see on the right, there's Clementine Paddleford, petting the dog, Cecily Brownstone, food editor of AP. This is Wilma Lord Perkins, the second from the left. She was the editor of the Fanny Farmer books through several editions of the Fanny Farmer books. So what James Beard does in the Fireside Cookbook and how he really begins to identify an American food is he takes a lot of the French recipes that he's learned from Jan Owen and he Americanizes them. So instead of sort of presenting French recipes and saying, here's something that comes from France, what he does often in this book, and which he'll do a lot during his career, is to just sort of translate French recipes into American ingredients and using English rather than French. So he presents in the Fireside Cookbook a recipe for what he calls country omelet. And it's a French recipe, omelet paysanne, which uses salt pork, which uses potatoes. James Beard just sort of translates it to American bacon, doesn't mention the original, and changes the name, country omelet, and puts it across as something that is convincingly American, that maybe people have been making in the United States for years. It fits comfortably, potatoes, bacon, eggs, onions. It feels convincingly like it could be American, even though it's not at all. And this is one of the great things that he really pioneers in this book and that he really owns, which is to take rustic, simple French recipes and just sort of turn them into American ones. He's still also publishing recipes that are French, cassoulet, etc. But in many cases, he's just sort of translating French recipes into American ones. And this, really impresses food editors. Jane Nickerson of the New York Times is absolutely enthralled with James Beard. Feels like he's a genius in doing something absolutely original. This is the complete book of outdoor cookery that he writes with Helen Evans Brown. That's published in 1954. And that's based on books. And I'm kind of going too slow here. So sorry, folks. I'm going to speed this up so I can get to it. So at the same time, James Beard is really interested in writing that sort of personal narrative book that American publishing hasn't really wanted or hasn't had much success with. James is quite taken, of course, with the Alice B. Toklas cookbook, which comes out in 1953, that sort of seamlessly fuses autobiography and recipe. Instead of the MFK Fisher style, which is to present a sort of essay and then perhaps there's a recipe at the end of it, Alice B. Toklas really incorporates recipes within the narrative of her sort of memoirs, essentially, of her life with Gertrude Stein. 1959, James Beard publishes what becomes his most successful cookbook to that date, which is the type of cookbook that he hates, which is the recipe Bible. So this has hundreds of recipes, anything that the buyer would possibly want to make. Very little voice, very little personality, And ironically, it's his most successful book, his best-selling book. Also, it's because of the format. He works with Dell, which instead of publishing a hardcover book and then maybe a year or two later coming out with a paperback, Dell publishes the James Beard Cookbook as a cheap paperback, as a cheap 75-cent paperback. Instead of having to go to a bookstore, a bookshop to buy it, you could buy it at a supermarket. You could buy it at the newsstand. And there's James Beard on the cover with Alsatian choucroute garni. It's hard to think of a more sort of quintessential rustic French dish, but he brings this American spirit to it. Dell is quite nervous about this photo. And this is also the first time that a cookbook has a photo of the author on it. And James Beard can pull this off because by 1959, he's a national figure. He's becoming a national figure. His face, his body are part of his fame. He brings so much bonhomie and good humor and this sense of pleasure and good living that he really kind of embodies. But American food, the idea of American food and the idea, America's love with French restaurants, with haute cuisine, with continental food is changing. So this is 1959 also. Craig Claiborne, who's still the relatively new food editor at the New York Times, writes an expose on gourmet restaurants called Elegance of Cuisine is on wane in US. The New York Times publishes this on page 1. And so this idea that these haute cuisine French restaurants, that they're the best food in America, is really starting to be challenged. Craig Claiborne says, the level of cooking and the service at these places is substandard in many cases. And so America's sort of looking for something beyond the haute cuisine French restaurant. James Beard, outdoor cooking, where he starts to write a little bit about his childhood on the Oregon coast. So again, this feeling that he's sort of starting to take his experience growing up in Oregon. He's looking at growing up in an American region, the food of an American region of coastal Oregon, and saying that this is really the best of American food, not the food that you might get at Jack and Charlie's 21 in New York or Quo Vadis in New York. And in 1964, this becomes James Beard's Delights and Prejudices. And this is really in a way, his manifesto of growing up on the coast. You can see there's a little drawing of him on the beach at Gearhart, and really eating from a region. So eating all of the salmon that's available on the West Coast, indigenous crabs, and foraging for berries, all of the berries that are available in Oregon. And he really suggests that this is what is the glory of American food, is eating in a particular region. So it kind of harkens back to those books in the 1930s, like Sheila Hibbins, about regional cooking in the United States being a collection of regions. James Beard really explores this in a way that it hasn't really been explored before, certainly not to a popular audience. When I was doing the book, I remember interviewing Alice Waters, and she, great sort of architect of, the delicious revolution of kind of regional food, of farmers markets, and, eating what grows and is raised near where you live. And she mentioned what a huge influence this book had on her thinking, this idea that you could eat and forage what grows in your region, and that really expresses something unique about your food. That really expresses something unique about American food. So all of the sort of French restaurants that were heralded as the best, that use these imported, canned truffles from France and canned foie gras from France, that had been considered, the peak of American dining, suddenly food, America has this sort of confidence in its own food that, a dish of ham and eggs, if it's cooked properly, and if you've sourced the ham properly, if it's a real smokehouse ham, could be as delicious as some, expensive Tony French dish. Prejudices. And at the same time, there's other sort of nostalgic visions of American food that are quite different from James Beard's. This is Margaret Rutkin's Pepperidge Farm Cookbook, also published by Athenaeum, that published Delights and Prejudices. And it's a more sort of canned, nostalgic version of American food. Here's James Beard with Julia Child in 1964. James and Julia become friends after 1961, when James really helps promote Mastering the Art of French Cooking, sort of introduces Julia to the food world in America, which is really all concentrated on New York City. So I'm just going to go quickly here. So the idea of American food kind of reaches that particular kind of foraged regional vision of American food sort of reaches this kind of beautiful peak in 1964. But then, in the 1960s, American life is changing tremendously. And any idea of being able to define what American food is in this growing, this time of growing diversity, and this time of, this really sort of politicized time, much like we are living through right now. This is, of course, the Cuyahoga River in Ohio, which combusted. For years, it had been a dumping ground for industrial chemicals. And so this sort of burgeoning environmental movement, or this exploding environmental movement, protests against the Vietnam War, gay liberation movement, happening in Greenwich Village, right near where James Beard lives. In 1972, Little Brown publishes James Beard's American Cookery, which in this moment of ferment in American culture, in American politics, in American society, it's definitely a sort of backward, looking take on what American food is. James Beard, it takes him, 5 or 6 years to research and write this book. It wasn't originally pitched as an American cookbook. It was going to be, it was called informally Everything James Beard Knows About Cooking. But at that point, it wasn't really possible. James Beard so embodied, cooking in America, that it was sort of inescapable that, especially at this time of ferment in American life, that he would be associated with the term American cookery. And to sort of address that, he sort of looks back at historical recipes from the 19th century and some of his favorite cookbook authors like Eliza Leslie, Fannie Merritt Farmer, and sort of revives some of these recipes. For a younger generation, for some people in the sort of younger generation in 1972, this is definitely sort of reactionary and backward looking. But to many Americans, especially more conservative Americans, who were the audience for James Beard's cookbooks, this is a very sort of comforting take on what American food is. It really sort of reassures them at this time of great change and ferment that there is something that's sort of abidingly good and valuable about American food. Some of the illustrations, some of the places where James Beard sourced these recipes, borrowed them, adapted them. And to sort of illustrate the difficulty, at this point, Craig Claiborne had sort of stepped down from the New York Times, Craig Claiborne being a great supporter and friend of James Beard's. And Raymond Sokoloff is this sort of young writer who is the food editor of the New York Times. And when American Cookery comes out, Raymond Sokoloff reviews it in the New York Times, and he reviews it with 2 other cookbooks, which James Beard sees as this great insult, because this is his great life's work, this encyclopedic book. So Raymond Sokoloff reviews it with a book by this sort of back to the lander woman named Sandra Otto about reviving old American recipes. And he reviews it with this book, Edith Bunker's All in the Family Cookbook, which is, a stunt book, published. It's written in Edith Bunker's voice. And so, Raymond Sokoloff says, what is American food? Let's look at 3 books to find out. First of all, when American Cookery comes out, James Beard's friends and colleagues sort of write to him. MFK Fisher writes to him and says, "You have definitely proved your point." She sort of complains that it's too big and heavy and it's hard to read in bed. But she says, "You have definitely proved your point that there is an American cookery, and you have done it with such deftness." But Raymond Sokoloff is sort of offended by this whole idea of trying to define American cookery, and by really sort of narrowly looking at a kind of Eurocentric view of what American cookery is. James Beard is really not that interested in, contributions of Black cooks in the South, of immigrant cooks, except for a few immigrant groups, really not interested in talking that much about Asian influences in American food. Let's see, and I'll just share with you a bit of Raymond Sokoloff's review from the New York Times. Sokoloff writes, "America is not a homogeneous nation state like France, and American cooking is a federation of recipes that has grown up with local roots," which of course is what James Beard sort of taught Americans through Delights and Prejudices. And so he sort of blasts it as this failed project, which of course it is if you're looking at it to sort of define what American food is. James Beard was always asked, especially after this book was published, to define American food, and he of course couldn't, especially in a soundbite. And eventually he would just start saying, well, it's whatever Americans are eating. Whatever Americans are cooking, that's American food, which is probably in some ways, the most satisfying and honest answer he could have given. So I think I'm going to stop there, and let's see. Stop sharing, and then, thank you very much. I sort of wanted to talk about American food through the lens of these 3 books, how hard it is, impossible it is to define it, how much James Beard really sort of shaped a generation or two's notion of cooking in America. And then, of course, even before he died, the sort of sense of trying to define American food was just impossible.
Okay, thank you, John. I've been monitoring the chat. I'm not sure if it didn't work or people were not moved to ask questions at the time. I think Pam, if you want to take the reins back, and I guess let John decide if he'll take questions one at a time, if we can do that in an orderly way. And I think someone's going to have to unmute themselves in order.
I actually see a question in the chat.
Oh, I see. Yeah, here comes one.
And I'll just read it. Did Beard gain his position entirely from cookbook writing, or did he have some formal cooking training? Which is a great question. He got it mostly from cookbook writing, although his fame, the sort of focus of a lot of stories and profiles of him after in the late 1950s and beyond was for the James Beard Cooking School, which he launched in 1956. And so he eventually, starting in 1959, would teach his cooking school out of his home, so out of his townhouse in Greenwich Village on West 10th Street. And he continued this on West 12th Street in what is now Beard House. And so he wasn't able to take a lot of students. It was usually 10 or 12, but he got like tremendous coverage, starting in the New York Times and the National for his cooking school. It was expensive. And so it tended to be kind of well-off people who attended, typically as many men as women, which was unusual for the time. Men weren't supposed to be interested in cooking in the 1950s and 60s. And so, yeah, he got a tremendous amount of coverage and attention for the James Beard Cooking School. And those recipes from his classes eventually sort of filtered into his books as well. Okay, and then another question: did Beard have any contact with his sister after he left Oregon? Yeah, that's a good question. He did stay in contact with her. I think it was sort of on the level of Christmas cards every year and letters. Also, James Beard's father, John, in this unhappy marriage, he had a sort of parallel family. So he was with another woman, and James Beard found this out when he was in his late 30s, that his father had another woman who he had a relationship with, and they had a child together. They had a son, and James Beard kept in touch with his half brother. I was never able to find out who he was. He was very quiet. He was very quiet about it. So I, went through his address book, looking at all these names, and just could never find out who it was. How did his relationship with his family change as he became more successful? He did not have a relationship with his father. His father died in the late 1940s. His father was not, it was clear that James Beard was gay. His father was not accepting of that. His mother died in the early 1940s. He had a really strained relationship with both of his parents. His mother was not a sort of loving, nurturing, or not a kind of nurturing kind of parent. And James Beard had a lot of bitterness toward his parents. Why should American food be defined as regional food? Isn't all cooking regional? Italian, French, Chinese, all are primarily dependent on where the cook is. Absolutely true. Although the understanding in the United States in earlier decades, this was not the understanding of the United States and of many Americans. There would be, as I say, sort of regional celebrations of American food, but overall, if you look at what is celebrated in American food, it's the quality of sort of French and continental restaurants, and also in the how accessible food is. The sort of great supermarket revolution. That American food's packaging, and that you can buy tomatoes in January and strawberries year round. Like this is in the 1950s and 60s. This is celebrated as one of the great achievements and something that really marked American food. Let's see. Did Beard ever come around? Oh, I'm sorry.
John, let me interrupt a moment. I've got a message that I had toggled a switch on the control panel that wouldn't allow people to unmute themselves. I just want everyone to know that I fixed that, and I apologize.
Okay, next question. Did Beard ever come around to recognize how important African-American, Asian, and other cuisines were? Yes, he knew at the time, he grew up with the sort of Chinese-American cook, and he, his mother would have him dressed in sort of clothes that Chinese children would wear. He was an unusual child in that way. His childhood cook, Juliet, James Beard would eat He didn't eat oatmeal and porridge for breakfast. He ate, congee. He would eat rice porridge with dried fish or, chicken for breakfast. And yet he did not, he did present some, say, Chinese recipes in later books as American tastes were changing, but he really had no, he didn't really champion Chinese cooking, for instance. He really sort of took it for granted. In the early 1960s, he and Craig Claiborne and some other food writers made this trip, sort of through Asia. They went to Japan, they went to Hong Kong, they went to Thailand, they went to Turkey, and James Beard sort of loved the food, but he was never interested in really incorporating that in his books or what he taught to any great degree. And I think that also has to do with that also largely has to do with American cookbook publishing. I mean, you can see it's really not until the later 1960s, but really the 1970s, when American cookbook publishing is interested in any big way. I'm thinking of Judith Jones at Knopf, for instance, really interested in sort of bringing in, sort of finding, identifying authors of different cuisines, Madhur Jaffrey, Julie Sani, Virginia Lee. That really, I think, is a huge fault of American publishing. Someone says, I just want to share that James Beard is still, after all these years, my favorite cookbook author. And let's see, do the current James Beard Awards stress where white American food or more well-cooked international foods that now comprise America? Well, the James Beard Awards are in huge flux right now. They had kind of suspended the awards essentially for 2 years, and sort of pledged to look at the systemic sort of racism that exists in that organization, as in many others. So, just from what I see, it seems like the James Beard Foundation is really trying to, address that systemic racism that it has, that's been just part of the organization. So it'll be interesting to see when they resume the awards, presumably in 2022, who they will reward and highlight. Let's see. Your book talked about how much he tried to hide his true self from the public. Who was he totally candid with, if anyone? He had, the fact that he was gay was a huge open secret in New York food, which again was a very small insular world at that time, really revolving around New York. I mean, there were probably, you could count on probably 3 hands, the people who were important in food at that time. And, throughout American life, it was, there was a very strict code of keeping certain information out of public view. And James Beard did that, and his friends did that for him, and his colleagues did that for him. But he had a quite vivid, active, fun, private life, especially in Greenwich Village, with queer friends. And so, one of the places where that would happen was like Sunday brunch at his townhouse in the village. You could sort of drop in if you were a friend of his and knew him. Let's see. Beard was criticized for promoting products in his cookbooks. If I remember correctly, he had a connection with Howard Johnson's and used HJ's gravy in his recipe. Now it is very common for cook chefs to have contracts for promoting products. Was he one of the first to promote products in his recipes? He was not one of the first. It was a really common, it was very common. It was, it's difficult to make money as a food writer now. It was just as difficult then. And so, journalistic standards didn't really start applying to food writing until the 1970s, really. And so before that, yes, there was a lot of promoting. There was not much transparency. I remember Ruth Reichel telling me that when she went to the LA Times to become food editor there in the 1980s, they were on deadline, maybe the first issue that she took over. And one of the longtime staffers there was like, oh, we need to fill space, no problem. And she said she opened up this file cabinet and it was just jammed with recipes that came from food companies, Kraft, General Mills, all this stuff. And they were, of course, the recipes, most of the recipes that would get published in American newspapers throughout the 20th century were produced by food companies, to sort of sell their products. It wasn't transparent that, this recipe necessarily came from Kraft. So, all of food writing was really, the sort of line between PR, advertising, marketing, and food writing in a journalistic sense was kind of non-existent for most of the 20th century. And yeah, Beard struggled to make money. He spent a lot of money. He employed a handful of people. And so, yeah, he was always hungry for money. There, his friends would say, oh, you can't, you're promoting too many bad products. He claimed that he didn't promote anything that he didn't believe in. Maybe the only thing that he turned down was cooking wine. For years, a manufacturer of cooking wines tried to seduce him into promoting their wines. But Kikkoman soy sauce, I'm totally drawing a blank. Adolph's meat tenderizer. In the case of Adolph's meat tenderizer, his friend Helen Emmons Brown, another cookbook author, just thought it was horrible. Like she was like, you can't be promoting this stuff. But he would try to make it work. I think he knew better, but he was trying to make a buck. Let's see. Did you ever meet him? No, I did not. I'm fascinated by the photo you showed of Beard and Julia Child. When and where it was taken? Yeah, so the photographer of that photo was Julia's husband, Paul Child. He took a series of photos in 1964 at James Beard's house on West 10th Street. And Julia was there, I think, to teach a class at the James Beard cooking school. And yeah, they're really great photos. They're all at in the collection of Harvard Schlesinger Library. And then this looks like the last one. Beard was in Provence in 1970 when Julie and Richard Olney were there. He was trying unsuccessfully to lose weight. Can you talk about that time of his life and his relationships with these luminaries? Yeah, he had very complicated, yes, he was in Provence then, yes, and he did go to a clinic. James Beard, starting in the 1950s, had these cascading health crises. He had a history of heart disease in his family already, and then just the amount that he ate and drank, the amount that he worked and didn't take care of himself. He had a number of serious heart attacks, and was always trying to lose weight at some point at his doctor's begging. And so it got really bad. And so in 1970, he checked into this sort of famous weight loss clinic in the south of France, where he was, put on a restricted calorie diet and couldn't drink. It worked, but it wasn't. He would sort of bounce back. And yeah, his relationships with Julia and Richard Olney, they were very complicated. He had a lifelong friendship with Julia Child. She was responsible after he died for creating the James Beard Foundation. She was largely responsible for creating the James Beard Foundation in his name. He kind of wanted to disappear after he died and have his house sold and all his things auctioned off, which they were. But she rallied people to raise money to buy the house from the estate and to turn it into a memorial to James Beard. Basically, at the same time, he was jealous of her success. The way to make money was to be a cookbook author and also to be on television. James Beard was not comfortable on TV, at least modern TV. In the 40s, it was fine, but he was too hammy. He wasn't natural. He wasn't a natural on screen like Julia was. But he was, devoted. They were, I think, devoted to each other in many ways. James Beard was really inspired by Olney, and James also helped Richard Olney. Helped him find his literary agent. Really helped promote Simple French Food when it came out in, I think, '74, and really sort of helped promote Richard. Richard was, I think, a very difficult person, and he also felt, I think James Beard felt like he was very generous in sort of promoting other food writers, but you sort of had to play along. There would be something he would want in return. And I think Richard Olney was kind of offended and horrified by that. Richard had a very elevated sense of his own talents. I mean, he was extremely talented, of course, but they just did not get along in that way. And in Richard Olney's memoir, he writes quite scathingly about James Beard. So that seems to be it. Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate you guys letting me come and talk to you.
Well, I'd say you're welcome.
Yeah.
It's been a delight for all of us. Pam?
Thank
Yeah,
you so much, John. It was just absolutely fascinating to hear so much about James Beard, and just really a deeper understanding of what he contributed to the evolution of food through the 50s and 60s. You're right. You just know so much more about the influence of Julia Child because of TV. And, I did not, think about James Beard as much of his influence as much. TV really does, you think about TV, which just really is much more powerful. And at least for the generation I'm in, that's kind of where we got more of our information. And also just, you know what? Those golden books triggered something for me. I didn't realize golden books had a relationship to James Beard, and my grandmother had a stack of them, and I saw Nurse Nancy, and you know what? There were real Band-Aids in the Nurse Nancy book. How about that? Thank you for that little trip. I know it wasn't intended, but I really like that. Put me back in grandma's kitchen with the Nurse Nancy book on the table.
This was tremendous, and I hope, John, that you remember that since you've been kind enough to give us this presentation, our gift back to you is a year's free membership in our group, and
Awesome.
and we would love for you to Zoom in and join us because we have quite the lineup coming up this year. Very different, just all over the place, people from all over the world and different topics, and we would love to have you, become a part of us, of course.
Well, thank you very much. I'll definitely.
Second Sunday of the month, this is the time. And so
Great.
I think you're on the list now, and you'll be receiving information about the Zoom link for the event. So I hope you do consider joining us because we would very much love to have you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
This was wonderful. And I hope everybody goes out and buys your book because you just scratched the surface. I mean, there's so much in there that's just fascinating.
Great.
There's another question here. I see. What are you working on now? Are you working on another book, or what projects?
Yes, I am. I'm starting to write some stories for the New York Times. I have another one due this week. It'll be next month. But yes, I am just finishing up a proposal for a next book, which is a memoir, but it's about my collecting cookbooks, about my sort of life with cookbooks
We have several cookbook collectors here on this call, on this Zoom, I believe. I mean, Everybody who's a collector cookbook, if your video's on, do raise your hand because I think you have a lot of kindred spirits among the group.
We'll be looking for that book.
All right. Well, thanks again, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.